So tonight's meeting, the primary topic is LCFF budget overview. So again, we have our Assistant Superintendent of Administrative Services, Andy Cantwell, to present on that. And then I will turn over the presentation back to myself and explain a little bit of how LCAP and supplemental funding fit into the overall LCFF budget. And then we'll review some of the information that we went through this fall and just in the last month or two about where we're at with our budget for next year. And then the last piece we'll do is solicit some ideas on what we can do for English language learner supports in our school. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andy Cantwell to get started with tonight's presentation with our LCFF.
Excellent. Thank you. And good evening. Again, my name is Andy Cantwell. I am the Assistant Superintendent for Administrative Services. Tonight, I'm going to be giving a brief presentation that is really an excerpt of a broader discussion that took place before a board meeting on December 14th, 2023. I want to orient ourselves in the kind of broader timeline of the budget process for a school district. The budget cycle begins on or before July 1st of each calendar year. Our fiscal years run from July 1st to June 30th. The board adopted the current year's budget in the final week of June of 23. We continue to monitor the budget regularly throughout the year. The first official look that the board takes at the budget again is in December. I am going to slow down for our translators. I apologize for my speed, and so bear with me. In December, the board receives a formal report from our fiscal team presenting the first interim revisions or update to our school budget. They will receive a second interim revision in March that by law must go to the board by March 15th. We begin building the budget for the next fiscal year through the spring. Our fiscal year again closes on June 30, and we bring back to the board our actuals, what we call our unaudited actuals, no later than September 15th. So again, within that timeline, we just presented to the board an update to the budget in December. And I'm going to go over the high view highlights of that interim update from December. I think a really important element that I begin with when looking at our overall district budget is our ending fund balances. When we look at all of the revenues that we bring in and all of the expenditures which we incur in a given year, the amount that will remain is our ending fund balance. And on the unrestricted side, this really is the funding that the district has available to meet new needs or to meet future needs. And what you should be able to see on the PowerPoint is that we are projected to end the current fiscal year with a really healthy ending fund balance of $31 million. That's great news. That's one of the strongest ending fund balances this district has ever seen. The main reason for that is due to significant one-time funding that came during COVID that allowed us to retain some of the LCFF funding to help us weather the impacts of our enrollment decline. And you'll see that we are going to be spending next year more than we're bringing in. That's what happens when a $31 million reserve turns into a $20 million. We will be spending approximately $11 million more next year than we are in the current year. The following year, we're projecting to spend another $10 million more than we'll be bringing in, and that's why you see over the next 3 years a projection of a reduction in our ending fund balance from 31 million down to 10 million. With that $10 million number in 2025-26, the majority of that is actually restricted by the state. They call it a reserve for economic uncertainties. That money cannot be utilized by the board for budget priorities at the local level unless certain fiscal conditions exist requiring to have a fiscal emergency declared for the district. It's unusual and it's not a good situation when a district must petition the county and the state for permission to access that reserve. So for all purposes, what we're projecting is that in 2025-26, we really will have exhausted our available reserves beyond the state minimum. The only way that we're able to meet this minimum reserve level is by anticipating a $3 million cut to the general fund in the 2024-25 fiscal year. This is, again, separate from any changes to LCAP or to supplemental funding. This is the broader budget for the district. We're required a $3 million expenditure reduction in the next fiscal year and the next school year in order to meet that minimum threshold in the third year. We're going to jump into a look at the revenues and the changes between last year and this year. And this is a really key slide. As I said, we were able to develop a strong reserve due to fiscal prudence by the school board that said that even though we were receiving some of those COVID funds as a priority to make sure that we were ready for when challenging times may face the district. And so last year we received $240 million. This year we're only anticipating 217. So that's almost a 10% reduction in our revenue. And that reduction is going to continue in the future years. Our local control funding formula, even with a COLA increase, a cost of living increase next year, will be lower than it is this year due to declining enrollment. Now, if we compare that, the expenditure side with the revenue side, this can be a bit confusing. And so go ahead and let's move to the expenditure side. You'll see that the expenditures look like they are increasing significantly. Part of that is the reality of compensation increases that we were able to secure for our teachers and other employees within the district. A raise, the first of which took place over the summer and the second in the past 2 months. But it also is the way that we received some of our funding this year. We're required to show an expenditure offset. And so the $240 million is not the best representation for where we will end the year. And so I just say that as a preparatory or preface for our second interim. That number will go down, and that is the normal budgetary process. So what's driving these expenditure changes, though? Because we still are seeing significant changes to our expenditures. First is our pension contributions to all of our staff. Our teachers participate in a program called the State Teacher Retirement System, STRS. The rates that the district contributes on behalf of a teacher is set at the state level. It has more than doubled in the past decade. Sorry. So again, the required contribution to pensions for teachers has doubled in about a decade. The required contribution that the state imposes on all school districts for classified workers for the current year is just over 26%, 26.68. And you can see that's increasing each of these next years. This is also more than a doubling in the past decade. Further, our expenditures to service our some of our most vulnerable and high need students within special education has increased and is continuing to increase next year. We have identified a few other factors. One, certainly that many other families in this community have been experiencing the increases to health insurance costs, as well as the impact of inflation on all variety of expenditures for a business and for our school district. So this was, again, a presentation I gave in December, and I am sorry to not have better news in February than December as we look at the state challenges. In early December, the Legislative Analyst Office issued a highly anticipated financial outlook report. And within that report, they projected a $68 billion budget deficit at the state level. To frame that number, the state budget is roughly $200 billion. So a very significant deficit was identified. In January, the governor released his numbers. The numbers were a little bit better, about a $38 billion deficit rather than $68 billion. However, still a very substantial number that will have an impact on education. So we continue to eagerly watch what's taking place in Sacramento as it drives so much of the funding for us locally. But what we know is that the significant increase in one-time funds is not going to continue. We have exhausted our COVID funding and many other one-time funds that were received. And so we have fewer funding sources moving forward. We have increasing expenditures, and we know that we have new needs that we are identifying and new challenges as we seek to recover learning loss from COVID, as well as meet the needs of our students today. And with that, I'm going to ask Robin to give the budget overview of how we intend to help meet some of these needs.
Take a moment to pause if there's any questions about the slides that Mr. Cantwell just presented. And I apologize, I got behind a little bit on those last two slides, so I'm going to leave those up for just a second regarding the challenges at the state and also our local challenges. But if you do have questions, go ahead and post those to the chat pool. We can respond to those before we move forward. So now we're going to get to more specifically our LCAP supplemental budget as a portion of our overall budget within the BUSD. So LCFF overview when it pertains to our LCAP and our supplemental funds. The local control funding formula, again, is a state funding formula. What Mr. Cantwell described for the most part was our base funding based on average daily attendance. And the majority of this funding goes to pay for salaries, benefits, and other operations to keep the district running. In addition to that, we receive supplemental funding, which is what the majority of our LCAP expenditures are. And those are a supplemental grant equal to 20% of the adjusted base grant multiplied by ADA and the unduplicated percentage for targeted pupils. And I'll get to a slide for unduplicated pupils. But those students include English language learners, students in foster care, students who are homeless, and students who are socially economically disadvantaged that are identified through the National School Lunch Program. And if you've been with us since the beginning, we talked the first meeting a lot about campaigning for our families to complete the meal application, as it's more than just a meal. It does give our school additional funds if they do qualify for the meal program. Another component of supplemental funding is concentration funding. This is a sort of kicker bonus funding for districts who have a very significant population of unduplicated students. The requirement to receive this funding is to have student population above 55% of your overall population to receive concentration funding. Burbank Unified does not have a high enough percentage of unduplicated students to receive that additional funding. So what we're talking about and what we have been talking about the last couple of presentations is really specifically just supplemental funding. And we have to spend that money using our local control and accountability plan. This is a image that was pulled out of our LCAP. This is called the budget overview for parents. And what this does is help visualize the slice of the budget that our supplemental LCAP budget makes up. And so you can see our LCFF funds from this year that we generated were about 11 million, and that's a pretty small portion of our overall operating budget. So what do we use this smaller budget to do? It's sort of how we do some of the work that doesn't get exhausted by salaries and other benefits just to keep our schools open and educate our children. This is where we can do some of those additional services that are targeted towards the populations that we've been discussing. A review of what our numbers look like as a district of our unduplicated pupil population. Or just a quick reminder, unduplicated means these students do not get to be counted twice in the overall total. They may qualify as both an English learner as well as foster or homeless, but they still only count once when it comes to generating funding. The two areas that are highlighted on this slide are our overall total enrollment as well as our participation in the meal program. Those two are trending downwards, which has been a conversation we've been having of declining enrollment. And what we've seen is declining enrollment is hitting our families that have free and reduced meals more so than our general population. So we anticipate that trend to continue, and that is part of the reasons our funding when it comes to supplemental funds is being reduced. The other group that I want to point out is English learners. That population, on the contrary, has been growing, and that's also been a big piece of a conversation as far as supporting those students. A lot of them are new to the country, learning English for the first time, and need a lot of support. So that has helped stabilize the funding that we receive in revenues, but we also don't anticipate that growth to continue. We may have plateaued when it comes to these new students, but it's also been a big part of the reason we feel we need to reallocate some of our funds in order to support this growing population. Our first interim, when it comes specifically to our supplemental funds and LCAP, is depicted here in this slide. It's broken down by the three primary goals. We do have 4 goals in our LCAP. However, we do not have any expenditures for goal 4 in our supplemental funding. All of goal 4 is funded through general fund dollars. But you can see where we budgeted and where we are at first interim. That does not mean we've spent this money at this point in the year. It means we're on track or we're projecting to spend this amount by the end of the year. So we're pretty close in most cases, but there is a little variable depending on if we had a vacancy for some time, if a position we were unable to fill, or sometimes we may be tracking towards spending more than what we allocated. So we have to look at not providing as many hours later in the year, or most of those hours were used up at the beginning. You can see those totals though as where we're trending and what things would look like if we continue based on first. When it comes to budget planning for next year, these are numbers that we used at the beginning of the year, this fall. We'll continue to monitor first interim, second interim to see how close we are to these. But this is where we base our budget for next year. And you can see we started this year with the carryover funds from the previous year. These are actually carryover dollars, not just from last year, but the last handful of years. And the reason these have accumulated is similar to what Andy was describing, or Mr. Cantwell was describing with our ending fund balance. Is these we had COVID dollars or other grant dollars that allowed us to save or accumulate some of our supplemental funds over the years of COVID. And so we've been using that and spending that down as we've gone the last year or two. That's the big difference when you look at next year's budget, is that we started this year with about $2 million in carryover. When we're looking at next year, at the end of this year, we're anticipating carryover of 824,000. That's a difference when it comes to what we would receive in revenues plus carryover. We did not make any changes to our LCAP and continued as we do. We would be projected to overspend by $1.2 million. So this is where we get to what we've had a lot of conversation about the last 2 or 3 meetings. It was also these decisions to reduce funding were brought to the school board last week so that they could give their input on our proposal. But what you can see here is not just what we're offering, but areas where we are reducing or removing from LCAP to be able to balance our budget. We are reducing by more than $1.2 million. And the reason we are doing that is we need to reallocate some of these funds to provide services for our English learner population. Dr. Paramo has done an amazing job of explaining how painful all of these cuts are. This is not a place we hoped to be or intended to be, but it is the reality of our budget. And so we are making the best decisions for our students and our population, really based on the communication and input we've received from principals, administrators, community members, parents through these meetings, our school board, and presenting to them. So this is really a collaboration and a process that has got us to where we are today, as far as identifying where we can reduce in our budget to be solvent and still provide some increased services for a growing population. If you have questions about these, I encourage you to look back at our previous meetings and those recordings where we went into great detail about the process and deciding on these. Reallocation of funds. This is looking at where we need to reallocate what we have saved beyond the $1.2 million. We need to we need to reduce that budget by that amount. We are reducing by $1,804,039. Excuse me, $1,804,039. That number is was pointed out was not the exact total of the reductions that we made in the previous slide. It's a difference of about $30,000. So I just wanted to clarify that that is a discrepancy between that slide and that total. However, $30,000 when it comes to a $12 or $13 million budget is about the wiggle room we need to operate without going in the red. So we will keep an eye on that small margin of difference to make sure we stay solvent. So we have about $600,000 to be reallocated in the LCAP. Conversations again with community administrators and everyone involved. We feel the best way to reallocate would be to put $220,000 to our English learner development supports in elementary. This has been left somewhat vague because what we intend to do with this goal or this action item next year is to work with our sites to determine how best to spend that money and how best to support our English learners. And what we've discovered is that this is a changing dynamic throughout the school year. As populations change, as we receive new families or immigrant families, that dynamic changes month to month sometimes. And just in a nutshell too, what we've heard is where we've used to work with English learners, traditionally that we have maybe Spanish and Armenian speaking students in our schools. We are now dealing with a classroom that may have not only Armenian and Spanish, but Russian, as well as many other languages that need support. So we need to be dynamic and flexible in how we support our classrooms. And the other item here is secondary English learner supports in core classrooms at the secondary. This is really specific to middle school for the most part, but there's some funding in here for high school as well. And the goal here is to replicate what we already do in English classrooms. In our English classrooms, we do have a smaller classroom size to be able to support our English learners in that setting. What we would like to do is replicate that smaller classroom size in math, science, and social studies to support those students in those other core classrooms as well. The last reallocation here is secondary summer school for special populations. This is a commitment on our end to continue to provide credit recovery options for any of our students that failed a special education class. That's not a requirement. Summer school in general is not a requirement for us as a district, but this is something that we're committed to in supporting that population. Having referenced summer school, I do want to point out that in the previous slide where we made reductions, the big piece really that came out was that secondary summer school at about $500,000. And that allowed us to make some adjustments to some previously discussed reductions. So that is a very big piece that we are working towards finding opportunities for our students through outside entities this summer. And that's a work in progress, and we feel good about the work we've done already to be able to provide those opportunities. So this brings us to the last part of our discussion this evening, and that is really a discussion about supporting our English learners and new immigrant families. We are looking to generate ideas from our community, from our parents, firsthand accounts of what supports these families need and how we can best meet their needs. So with that, we will open it up to questions about any of the previous information we presented this evening. But that's the topic we'd really like input on. If anyone would like to post in the chat any questions or ideas, or you are welcome to unmute and share what you think are some good responses to the questions on this slide. The question here is, where should students who would have a BUSD summer school turn? Will you be providing suggestions? What we have done in the past is had a process called a petition process, and this has allowed our Burbank Unified students to earn credits through an outside entity. Sometimes that's an online K-12 school that they can receive credits, high school credits like they would here, just through another organization. The other option that our students take advantage of is community college or university options that we will apply towards their high school graduation requirements. So that's also an option for students to take advantage of. We look to replicate that process for credit recovery and initial credit, and working on a comprehensive list of options for students to enroll in. Some are free, most are free actually. Some are paid, and so families can make a decision that best meets their needs, really based around what the program offers. Most of these are virtual or online, some are not. The timeline of when classes are may or may not fit into their summer schedule, so they can make a decision of what program best fits their needs. The third option that we've been working directly with is LA Valley College. We're really excited about a partnership with them. And they're working with us to provide some of the courses that we've traditionally offered through our own program to be able to offer to our students. And it looks like that'll be a hybrid option where students will come in person a few days a week and then complete a significant portion of the work. Okay. Next follow-up question to what I was just talking about when it comes to summer school is we're already working on that comprehensive list and kind of like a menu of options for our families to look at and choose from. We anticipate having that available by March 1st. And our goal is to make sure it's available and communicated so that it's time for families to be one of the first to register at these schools. So most of the registration windows for these programs begin around March or middle of March. So we're working to make sure this information is communicated out with well in time for them to be able to register and get signed up. It will be coordinated with our high schools and our counseling teams as far as signing up and notifying us that you're interested in this, and then we'll be looking at mechanisms to support students in registering and enrolling in these different. Question was asked, how will we communicate this information? And we will really be working directly with our counselors to, one, identify students in need of credit recovery and communicate directly with those students and families. For students that are looking for initial credit opportunities, it'll be pushed out through multiple means from our counseling departments. They have everything from Twitter to the webpage to email blasts. So we'll make sure that information's out and available. We're also not forgetting about our 8th grade students that do want to take initial credit for health or PE over the summer. So we'll be working with our middle schools as well to make sure a list of options for them has been shared. Okay, yes, can we post it on the BUSD Facebook page? Once we have that menu, we'll definitely link it there so that they can find that post and then access that document and resource. It will look very similar for families as what we've done in the past. So families that have either signed up or students that have signed up for credit recovery or initial credit are used to a Google form and signing up and putting in their information of interest. That piece will look very similar. We'll just be publicizing up front what those options are so that they can include that in that information. And then we'll follow up as far as next steps to go ahead and register it. Question was, can you go back to slide with 2 circles and explain the difference between 2 circles? And I believe our slide, are we talking about the supplemental budget over? Yes. Let me get a bigger version of that in front of me.
I'll attempt to answer that. So we're looking at the overall funding for the district on the left. You'll see the primary funding, as Dr. Andrews has said, is LCFF, Local Control Funding Formula Funds. However, we do receive some money from the federal government. Approximately 3% of our overall district budget comes from the feds. We also receive other funding sources from the state outside of LCFF in an order of magnitude about 1/7 of our overall budget. And then we have some local funding sources. If you look at that pie that's LCFF, it's about 81% of our overall funding comes to us through that method. And if you pull that pie out, that's what you see on the right, and it breaks up the LCFF pie by the base grant and the supplemental grant. So of the portion of our state or of our district budget that comes to us for LCFF, 157.7 million is base grant. That's funding for all students. And just over 11 million is supplemental.
And where this diagram came from is this is a template that the state requires. And so it's been posted on our LCAP page as part of our LCAP plan. Again, it's identified as the budget overview for parents. And so this is just a mechanism, like Andy or Cantwell just described, visualizing how the budget breaks down for a district. The light blue base grant, yes.
The light blue in the circle on the left is base grant and supplemental combined. It's all LCFF. The smaller pie to the right is taking that light blue shaded amount and it's then separating it and then saying of that amount, which is base grant and which is supplemental. So I'm not sure if the question was referring to the light blue in the larger circle. If so, that's total LCFF. The light blue in the smaller circle is supplemental.
Great questions. I'm glad we could provide that explanation. Any other questions of the slides, or again, any ideas that you would like us to look at or look into as far as supporting English language learners on our campuses? And again, this is not the only avenue or venue that we solicit ideas for this. We will be working directly with our DLAC committee, which is our parent advisory group for our English learner programs. And so we'll be working directly with them for ideas as well, which is that committee is comprised of a lot of English learner parents that know firsthand some of the difficulties their students encounter as far as getting an education with that barrier. Does look like we may have exhausted all of our questions for this evening. We will again be meeting soon. We have more meetings this spring. What the next handful of meetings will be are looking at our metrics, those that we're able to report out on. And what we'll do is look at our how we're meeting our goals and doing towards the goal for each of those metrics. That the purpose of that is to start to evaluate our programs and how we're spending the funds to determine if some adjustments need to be made. We've committed to some degree to a budget for next year already, as far as identifying where we need to reduce and where we want to continue. But what we can do is have a conversation about how that money's spent or how those services look in our classrooms and in our schools. So the next meeting will be specifically regarding instructional services and all of our instructional action items and metrics. That's really the meat of goal 1 in our LCAP. Then we will have another meeting on goal 2, educational services, and looking at if we're meeting our intended goals when it comes to supporting students and their mental health needs and everything a student requires to be healthy and successful school. And then our last meeting will look a little bit at goal 3 as far as what we're doing with staffing and meeting and hiring very qualified staff for our district. And we'll also at that meeting go back and circle back on our overall budget. At that time, we hope we will have some more information on potentially on second interim, and that'll lead us into really the last piece of the LCAP process, which is town hall meeting with our school board to really solidify our plans for next year. We appreciate your participation in this process. It is a process. We are on a 3-year cycle. So next year kicks off a new 3-year plan. So this is the year to make those adjustments. And we hope to see you at our next meeting when we talk a lot about our goal 1 and instructional goals. Thank you, everyone, this evening. We will see you next time. And please don't hesitate to check our website for information about upcoming meetings and our previous presentations. Thank you and have a good night.